Hey, this is Mr. Harper, and today we're going to be talking about the War of 1812. So get ready, here we go. In 1812, Britain and France were fighting yet another war. These guys never stopped fighting, it seems like. Britain and France were both impressing sailors. Now, impressing them doesn't mean that they really liked the French clothes, or they really liked the British clothes, or they had big ships so they were impressed. No, impressing means that they captured the American sailors and then forced them to work on their ships. And the only problem with this is a lot of these American sailors originally were British sailors. Some of them had escaped from the British Navy and gotten on board American ships because, hey, they knew how to be sailors, so why not get on an American merchant ship and make some money that way? So that's kind of cool. But the British didn't think it was so cool, so they were impressing American sailors. Now, the British were impressing far more American sailors than the French. So, basically, by 1807, you get the embargo of 1807. Thomas Jefferson is president at the time, and basically the embargo is a complete and utter failure. Basically ban all trade with foreign countries, which ruins the American economy. And that doesn't work, so they move on. Now, another cause for the War of 1812 is America's desire for more land. Now, the Americans had just completed the Louisiana Purchase from France, doubling the size of the country, but Americans were greedy, and they looked north to Canada, and they said, hey, let's go take over Canada. Why not? They got some nice resources. Yeah, it's cold, but they have a lot of moose, and they have a lot of trees and oil. Well, they weren't looking for oil yet. That comes later. Anyways, so they decide we're going to take over Canada. Now, interestingly enough, when the Americans had broken away from England, gotten their peace treaty and everything, they actually had asked Canada to join them as an independent nation, and the Canadians refused. So they just liked being British too much at the time, I guess. So Americans wanted this land in Canada, and they figured, hey, why not? Maybe they'll join us now, 20 years later. So there were a group of Republican congressmen from the South and West. They were war hawks, and these weren't Republicans in a modern Republican sense. They weren't part of the modern Republican Party. These were actually closer to modern Democrats in a way, and in fact, they were called the Democrat Republicans in some circles. So it's very confusing, and I'm sure they planned this to confuse students in the future. Needless to say, these guys had nothing to do with modern political parties. But they were war hawks. They were led by Senator John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, and Henry Clay of Kentucky. And James Madison wins election as president in 1808. And in the spring of 1812, he decides we're going to go to war with Great Britain. And he asks Congress to declare war. And the war hawks from the South and the West win the vote, and they declare war. Now, here's some of the problems after they declare war in the War of 1812. First off, the Americans were highly unprepared for war. The British came across the border and captured Detroit, which was basically a fort with a small village near it. And the Americans invade Canada, but really failed to make any permanent inroads there. And one of the places they went to was York. They fought several battles, but York was the most important because that was the capital of the British province of Canada. And they burned a lot of the government buildings that were there. They looted the town and then left. But at the end of the day, they end up being forced back into the United States. So Native Americans helped the British for the most part because people like Tecumseh were on the British side. They figured the British would be more fair with them than the Americans had been. The Americans keep shoving them further and further west and out of their lands. And so they figured the British were the lesser two evils, I guess. And the war at sea, the U.S. Navy is very young at this time, very small. It's outnumbered. In November 1812, the British blockade the Chesapeake Bay and the Delaware Bay. And these are two of their big entryways into shipping on the rivers there and some of the major cities. And this really hurt the United States. And the blockade got bigger and bigger as the war went on. And by 1813, most American ships were not able to leave their ports. At sea early in the war, even though the Americans were outnumbered, they did have three of the fastest frigates in the world. And they were actually able to win using a frigate called the USS Constitution. They actually won a big battle and sunk several British ships and captured several British ships using that USS Constitution. And they called her Old Ironsides because she had really thick sides. So they were wood with some iron sheeting applied to it for protection, and the cannonballs would just bounce off. And then in 1814, the British land near Washington, D.C., and British soldiers come into town. Now, before this, President Madison is riding around on his horse, and he's a short guy. He's barely over 5 feet tall, and he's riding around trying to drum up support and tell people it's going to be okay. And can you imagine a president doing this today? I can't. Secret Service would never let him do it, obviously. So anyways, he's riding around trying to drum up support. Meanwhile, the British are marching up the peninsula toward Washington, D.C. And the British soldiers, they get there, everyone's evacuated, and the British soldiers burn the Capitol building, and they go to the White House, and they actually eat a meal on the White House china and loot everything they can and then burn it and other public buildings. And in fact, at the time, the White House is called the Executive Mansion, and it's actually gray. It's gray stone. And it's because of the War of 1812 that the White House gets painted white. It gets painted whitewashed basically after the war. And the reason they whitewash it, got the brush, whitewash. The reason they do this is to cover up the burn marks, obviously. So, before the British do burn the White House, though, Dolly Madison saves a bunch of papers. This is President Madison's wife. She's very popular in town, very social. People love her. She's fun to hang around with, fun to be at parties with. And she saves a lot of the important papers on the White House, and she saves the famous Gilbert Sullivan painting of George Washington, which we still have today because of her thinking ahead and saving it, because the British probably would not have treated that portrait very nicely. Then you get the famous battle at Fort McHenry. This is in Baltimore Harbor, and a lawyer named Francis Scott Key, he's on a British ship trying to get a prisoner of war released, an American prisoner of war released, and they keep him as prisoner as well, kind of. They keep him there while they're bombing the fort in the harbor. And there's an old British drinking song that the melody goes like this. Bum, 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 bum. Oh, wait, you know this song, don't you? Yes. The melody goes like that, and sailors like to sing it. So while he's on the ship, he hears sailors singing the song. And most likely he's heard it before anyways. It's pretty popular at the time. And so he writes down a poem about the flag, this giant flag the Americans have flying over Fort McHenry in the morning when the sun comes up, even though they've been bombing the fort all night. And he writes out this poem about that flag still flying in the morning. And he writes it, well, he names it the Star-Spangled Banner. And later he puts to that music, that British drinking song, and we get the Star-Spangled Banner we know today, and is our national anthem. And the last big battle of the War of 1812 is the Battle of New Orleans. And this actually happens in 1815, so the war actually lasted about 3 years. This is the most famous, most remembered battle of the war, and the Americans are led by General Andrew Jackson, and the battle actually takes place a few days after the war is over. Because at the time, communication technology was not what we have today, so to get information across from Europe would take several weeks on a ship. So, yeah, it took them a while to find out the war was actually over and the battle had been fought by that point. Now, Andrew Jackson, he's been leading the Tennessee militia, fighting the Creek Indians who were siding with the British at the urging of Tecumseh. And he was fighting with them, and he basically beats them. He doesn't really like Native Americans very much. And even though he pretty much hates Native Americans, and we'll see that later when he's president, but he actually adopts a Creek Indian boy. It's kind of interesting if you ever want to look it up. And adopts him as his son. Go figure. So, kind of a little odd note to that. Anyhow, the Battle of New Orleans, he actually leads the Americans to victory there over a really good British Army force. So he gains fame and notoriety from that, and later on he parlays that into a political career. He's very much an opportunist, and we'll talk more about him later, Andrew Jackson. But remember, he led the Americans at the Battle of New Orleans and won, beat the British. And then finally, the Treaty of Ghent is signed in December of 1815, and it's signed several days before the Battle of New Orleans actually takes place. And the British and the Americans meet in the city of Ghent, which is in Belgium, and they negotiate a peace treaty. And as a result of the war, what's the point? Why do we study this? Well, Britain and America become allies, basically. I know that's hard to believe, but eventually this leads to them becoming stronger allies. And they never really fight after this. They don't fight any wars or anything. Yeah, they have disagreements at times, but they don't really fight the Americans anymore. The British don't. And America gains some respect from other countries because they basically fought to a draw in the war. It's kind of weird. I mean, it's arguable no one really won because no one really wins in a war. Yeah. The big losers in the war were civilians in both the United States and in Canada. There were more civilians in the United States and Canada that died because of the War of 1812 than soldiers. So the big losers in this war were the civilian population of the United States and Canada. So that's the War of 1812. If you got any questions about it, ask me. If you want to learn more about it, look it up. Google is your friend. Okay.